Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith with us today. Professor Eugene is a professor of organizational behavior at Surrey Business School, University of Surrey, UK. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Birmingham and has research interest in intuition in decision making and hubris in leadership. His work has been published in prominent journals such as Academy of Management Perspectives, Academy of Management Learning and Education, and Organization Studies. Professor Sadler-Smith is the author of several influential books, including Intuition in Business, Hubristic Leadership, The Intuitive Mind, which has been translated into multiple languages, and The Hubris Hazard and How to Avoid It. He has contributed to professional publications and media outlets like Forbes and The Times. In this episode, Professor Eugene offers valuable insights from his latest book, Trust Your Gut, Go With Your Intuition, and Make Better Choices. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith to our podcast, where we look forward to gaining valuable insights from his expertise on this topic. It is a genuine pleasure to have you back with us today, Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith.
Deepak, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's a huge pleasure and, as always, a great honor to be on your podcast.
Professor Sadler-Smith, your book highlights the importance of intuition in decision making. Could you share what intuition means in the context of business and leadership and why it's such a valuable skill today?
So, yeah, it's a great question. What does intuition mean in business and why is it a valuable skill? I think maybe a good place to start with that, Deepak, is with an example of Amazon. So we all know about Amazon and Jeff Bezos and Amazon Prime. And in an interview in 2016 or 2018, I think it was, to the Economic Club of Washington, Jeff Bezos was asked about how he takes important decisions in business. And he gave the example of Amazon Prime. And the way he tells the story is that a junior software engineer came up with the idea of fast free shipping, which is the whole Amazon Prime concept. But when the accountants and the finance people in Amazon looked at this idea of fast free shipping, then it was horrendous. It just wouldn't work. The figures didn't add up. It was not viable economically, financially, economically, so on. But Jeff Bezos had to make a decision. And in that case, because he was moving into an area which was very uncertain, so nobody had designed the loyalty program for online retailing. So we'd had loyalty programs in the airline business, in restaurants, and so on and so forth. So there was no previous precedent to go on. So Jeff Bezos in that situation felt that he didn't have the necessary information to make the decision. However, he needed to make a decision. And so in that case, he trusted his intuition. And in that interview, Jeff Bezos said that in those kind of uncertain situations, which there are no precedents, there's very little data to go on really, because nobody had implemented Amazon Prime before. It was completely new. So I think a good example of where intuition is a really valuable skill in business is where managers have to move into these new uncharted territories in order to take decisions that nobody has taken before. And the way that I kind of think about intuition is, I think of it as almost like an internal radar system, a GPS system that can help you to sense the way forward. It doesn't come with any guarantee of success, but nonetheless, it can help you to sense the direction in uncertain circumstances. So it's in those circumstances which are very uncertain where I think intuition comes into its own. Where intuition doesn't work is in situations which are quantifiable, where you can quantify the risk, where probabilities are involved. In those kinds of situations, we don't need intuition because our analytical skills and analytical processes can deal with it. So I would say in situations of uncertainty, fast-moving situations, that's where intuition really comes into its own for senior business, for any kind of business leader. But the stories, that we've got from Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, all testify to the importance of intuition as an important skill in highly uncertain, volatile, complex, and ambiguous environments.
Professor, you discuss how intuition can help us make quicker and more accurate decisions in fast-moving situations. So can you elaborate on how we can improve our intuitive abilities, especially when we are faced with limited information?
All right. Yeah. Great question, Deepak. The answer to that question is very simple. How can we improve our decision-making abilities to take decisions in fast-moving situations? The answer is very simple. It comes down to 3 words: practice, practice, and practice. Oh, so that's not very helpful, I know. But the reason I say that is there's a long history of research. And one of the great things about Business Talk as a podcast series is that it's based on research. And we've got many decades of research going back to the 1980s of how people take decisions in fast-moving situations. So the origins of the research really go back to work that was carried out by a guy called Gary Klein, very famous decision researcher who did work with firefighters. And he did in-depth interviews with firefighters to ask them how they took decisions in fast-moving, high-pressured, life or death situations. Because if we think about it, the firefighter situation a decision can't be taken in that situation in the kind of conventional analytical way. And the conventional analytical way to take decision is to list the positives of a situation, list the negatives, list the pros, list the cons, come to some balanced view about what the best way forward is. Well, in an emergency, fast-moving situation, you can't do that. It just doesn't work. It would be dangerous. And Gary Klein interviewed very successful, very experienced firefighters to try to ascertain from them how they took decisions in those fast-moving situations. And they said, actually, we don't take any decisions, which was a big surprise to him. And what they said to him that actually what happens is a solution to the problem, an action occurs to them intuitively. They then quickly run it through their head, almost fast-forwarding a DVD in their head to see if it will work. If it will work, they go with it. So there's really no decision. If their DVD in their head says that it won't work, they go to the next best option. So that was the original research, which has inspired a lot of the subsequent research on intuition in firefighting, in nursing, in aviation, and in business. And what Gary Klein's research demonstrated is that these firefighters had met similar situations many times in the past. And they'd analyze them through their training, through their learning, through their experiences. And what happens in that situation is that our analyses and our learnings and our experiences become frozen into intuitions. So one of the great geniuses of management, Herbert Simon, described intuitions as analyses frozen into habit and the capacity for rapid response through recognition. And I think that's one of the best definitions of intuition that we have, because it tells us that intuition, it's a little bit paradoxical. Intuition actually begins with analysis. Then over the years, that analysis becomes frozen, as Herbert Simon described it, into a habit. And then I guess what the question then is, okay, well, if it takes practice to become an intuitive expert, to become an intuitive firefighter, or an intuitive doctor, or an intuitive manager, how long does it take? The rule of thumb is kind of 10,000 hours or 10 years. Now that's very, very rough guidance. Basically, all we take from that it takes a long time to become an intuitive expert. There are ways in which we can speed that up, and I can talk about those a little bit later. But to answer your question, how can we develop those intuitive skills? It's through experience, it's through practice, and it's through learning. And the idea from Herbert Simon of analyses becoming frozen into habit over the longer term. And what that does, what Simon was getting at, and he did a lot of work with chess players, and he discovered that chess grandmasters who play intuitively actually don't do analysis. They recognize patterns on the board. Their playing is based on pattern recognition. So chess players do it. Gary Klein's firefighters recognize patterns and responded to those patterns. And similarly with managers recognize patterns, see patterns that they've met many times before and respond to them intuitively. So that's the basis, I think, of how intuition works in those fast-moving, uncertain situations.
Professor, in your book, you mention gaining insights into other people's state of mind, motives, and intentions through intuition. So how can leaders use intuition to better understand and connect with their teams and colleagues?
Okay, it's a great question. The examples that I gave from Gary Klein of firefighters and Herbert Simon and chess players, that's a type of intuition that I would call expert intuition. But there's more than one type of intuition. And the kind of intuition that you're mentioning there, Deepak, is what I would call social intuition. And that's where we make an immediate judgment of a person based on what's called in the research literature a thin slice of a person's behavior, sometimes as short as 6 seconds, can give us accurate information about that person's motives, their abilities, and their intentions. So this idea of thin slicing, it's well established in the literature, and we can, on the basis of a thin slice, come to quite an accurate judgment about another person. So I call that social intuition. Some people call it thin slicing. However, there's a big caveat or beware or drawback to that, because of course, in social situations and in making social judgments, we can be biased and prejudiced. So in those social judgment situations, we have to be really careful about whether our judgment is a genuine intuition that tells us something useful about the person, or whether it's actually a bias and a prejudice that we hold against a particular type of person that's coming to that's coming out in that situation. That's why, of course, organizations spend a lot of time and resources on unconscious bias training, because what unconscious bias training tries to do, I think, is to alert managers to the dangers of simply going with their intuition in, for example, a recruitment situation. And we've all been there in interview situations, either as the interviewer or the person being interviewed, who's also making a judgment. And as soon as the person walks into the room, our intuition kicks in. We can't help to come to an immediate judgment about them. And that judgment could be accurate, but it could also be a bias or a prejudice against them. And that's where we have to be really careful, not to simply go with our intuition because we could be being biased. That's why I think this idea of intuitive intelligence is really important, because I think intuitive intelligence for me means using your intuition. It sounds a bit tautological. Using your intuition in an intelligent and informed way, not simply following your intuitions without questioning it. And I think that one of the most significant situations in which that can happen is in the recruitment and selection situation, the social judgment situation.
Ethical decision-making often present challenges where rational thinking alone may not suffice. So how does intuition guide us in situations where we are ethically challenged, and how we can ensure it aligned with our values?
Okay, good question again. So, I mean, we're kind of going through the different types of intuition in a way, which is really useful, because I started off with Gary Klein and Herbert Simon, and they really were concerned with expert intuition. Then when we talk about social judgments, insights into other people's motives and intentions, we're talking there about social intuition. And then when we get into ethics and morals, we're talking there about moral intuition. And for many years, almost ever since the ancient Greeks, moral philosophers have argued that ethical judgments, moral decisions are rational. But in the past 20 years, psychologists have overturned that idea and said that actually our moral judgments, our ethical decisions aren't actually driven by rationality. They're driven by intuition. Because when we meet a moral dilemma, a moral issue, an ethical question, the first thing that happens is we have an intuitive response to it. So intuition is first. Intuition is fast. One of the things about intuition is it's involuntary and it's fast. It wins the race with analysis and with rationality. So intuition gets there first, it comes to a moral judgment, and then, so the social intuitionist model of moral judgment says, intuition happens first, and then rationality is used to then justify the intuitive moral judgment. Now, then you ask the second part of your question, Deepak, is really important, because then you can say, okay, well, if our moral decisions and moral judgments are intuitive, how do we know that that aligns with our values? That was your question. And here we have to be really careful, because just because a moral judgment is intuitive doesn't mean to say it's right. So it's easy to learn to take bad moral decisions intuitively, because through our upbringing, our values can be built, and we can build bad values. But if we've internalized bad values, if bad values are part of our nature, then we will take an intuitive moral decision, but it will be based on bad values. So to go right back in this argument then, of course, what the important thing there to do is to build the good values in the first place, to build, another word for a good value might be a virtue. So to build the virtues, and then through character development and moral development, and then if we have those virtues, we've internalized those values or those virtues, then we can take intuitive, fast, quick, right moral decisions. But the intuition comes second to the values, if that makes any sense. The values and the virtues come first, and then we can take decisions intuitively based on those values. So the intuition has to align with the values to be a right decision.
Professor, you emphasize the connection between intuition, creativity, and innovation. Can you explain how nurturing our intuitive intelligence can lead to more creative and innovative solutions to business dilemmas?
Yeah, great question. Again, this is Deepak. I really like the line of your questioning here, because we've done expert intuition, we've talked about social intuition, we've talked about moral intuition, and now this takes us to what I think is the fourth type, because I think there are 4 types of intuition, which I call creative intuition. And creative intuition is really important in scientific discovery. It's really important in invention and innovation, and of course in entrepreneurship. And one of the good things about creative intuition is that one of the best ways to have a creative intuition is to not think about it. So in a way, I and other people talk about creative intuitions as being a product of thinking without thinking. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that our analytical mind is our conscious mind. That's the mind we use to solve problems, to do analyses, do a spreadsheet, solve an equation. That's the analytical part of our mind. Some people call it system 2, and it's conscious. But alongside the analytical part of our mind is something else that we call system 1. And I've called in the past the intuitive mind, and that's unconscious. But just because it's unconscious doesn't mean to say it can't solve complex problems. It can. And this is where this idea of thinking without thinking comes from. There's actually a technical name for it. A Dutch psychologist called Ap Dijksterhuis did some really fascinating work several years ago on what he called unconscious thought theory. And in unconscious thought theory, the experiments that the Dutch psychologist and his colleagues did demonstrated that sometimes if we're faced with a complex decision, like, a complex decision, for example, which house to buy, which car to buy, they're complex decisions versus a simple decision such as which toothpaste or which shampoo to buy. He found that when to take a complex decision is often better taken without deliberating, without thinking hard about it, and going with your intuitive response, because his argument was that the intuitive mind, or system 1, the unconscious processing system, can do something that the analytical mind or the conscious processing system can't do. And it can process lots of information in parallel. So you imagine the situation of deciding whether to buy a new EV, a new car, buy a new house or whatever. Then there's lots of information coming at you about, the engine, the price, the mileage, the service costs, etc., etc. There's lots of information to make sense of. And unconscious thought theory says that it's really hard to make sense of that information analytically because there's too much information coming at you. So leave it to the intuitive mind, leave it to system one, because in computer terms, it's a parallel processing system which can deal with lots of incoming information, lots of different types of information, and come to a decision by integrating it all together. So that's an example of unconscious thinking. But the other thing that unconscious thinking can do is that it can make connections that our conscious mind can't do. And in the creativity literature, this process, it's called incubation. So where we've been working on a complex problem for a long time, and we can't find an answer to it. One way to solve that complex problem is to stop thinking about it, and to think about it without thinking about it. In other words, to send it away into system one, into the unconscious mind, into the intuitive mind, let the intuitive mind do its work on it, and then it presents itself back to us as what I would call a creative intuition, which then becomes an insight. And there are lots of examples in the literature, in the innovation literature, of where people have made these unconscious connections to come up with a groundbreaking idea. One of the most famous ones, it's on my desk here, Post-it notes. That's an example of a product that really has changed the world in one sense. And it wasn't a product of conscious thinking. It was a product of unconscious thinking and making connections between two things that hadn't previously been connected together. And lots of examples in the innovation literature of thinking without thinking, leading to important breakthroughs.
In the era of artificial intelligence and machine learning, why is intuition considered a uniquely human skill that can't be replicated by technology?
Okay, it's a great question, and it's a very timely question, a very topical question. Because if we think about AI, artificial intelligence, but then perhaps the ultimate form of AI could be artificial intuition, maybe. And who knows? No, we don't know where artificial intelligence will take us. But the question for me is, will artificial intelligence ever be able to replace human intuition? I think it could replace some types of human intuition in some way. So far, we've talked about 4 different types. We talked about expert intuition, social intuition, moral intuition, and creative intuition. I think the first type of intuition, expert intuition, is the one where artificial intelligence might be able to do a better job than human intuition can. And in fact, we've known that for a long time. If we go back more than 50 years, psychologists have shown that algorithms, even simple algorithms, simple flowchart algorithms, can sometimes outperform a human expert. And now where we are with machine learning and artificial intelligence, well, if intuition is about pattern recognition, then one of the things that artificial is really good at is recognizing patterns. And it doesn't get tired, it doesn't make mistakes, doesn't, etc., etc. So I think if artificial intuition is to be a reality, I think it will be in the area of expert intuition. But that then, of course, leaves the other 3 types of intuition: social, moral, and creative. And I think it's in those 3 types of intuition where artificial intelligence might not be able to compete with a human being. So in social judgment, I think human beings are really skilled in making social judgments. They're really skilled in social intuitions. Why? Because if intuition is about practice, well, we've had a lifetime's experience of making social judgments about other people. So in a way, we're all intuitive experts in social judgments. I'm not sure that a machine could ever replicate what a human being can do with regards to reading someone else's motives and their intentions. Similarly, when we talked about moral intuition, well, would we want to delegate moral and ethical decisions to artificial intelligence? I'm not sure that we would, but that could be a debate that people might be prepared to challenge me on. And then the other one, of course, creative intuition. So, I mean, I talk about this a lot in the book, in the final chapter of the book, about what we mean by creativity. So, for example, artificial intelligence can produce a painting in the style of Vincent van Gogh, and it can do it quite convincingly. But we need to ask ourselves, is that really creativity? Because in a sense, what all the artificial intelligence is doing is mimicking or copying the style of Van Gogh. But it didn't come up with the style of Van Gogh itself. So for me, the creative bit is coming up with the style of painting that Vincent van Gogh came up with, not copying the way that he did it. So I still think that even though people make lots of claims about artificial intelligence being creative, I think that raises lots of important questions about what we actually mean by creativity. And we need to ask ourselves, is the kind of creativity that artificial intelligence is capable of, is that really what we mean by creativity? And is it as creative as human creativity is? And I'm not sure, but there are lots of debates to be had about that. So I think in terms of the future of work and the future of the workplace, I think human beings will still have a lot to add through the kind of skills that intuition brings to the workplace. So, for example, in social intuition, empathy, moral judgment, creativity, they're all things that human intuition is really good at, and that a machine may never be able to do better than a human. So therefore, I would say, well, for a human being to remain competitive then in the age of artificial intelligence, a good thing for human beings to do is to develop their intuition, their creative intuition, their social intuition, their moral intuition, because that's where they can't be replaced by a machine. So that then, for me, that kind of emphasizes the importance of intuitive intelligence, because if intuition is something that can't be replaced by a machine, that gives humans an advantage in the workplace. Therefore, for me as a human being, it's probably important for me to develop my intuition to remain competitive and not to be replaced by a machine.
Professor, you mentioned that intuition comes from head, heart, and gut. Can you describe how we can nurture all three aspects of our intuitive intelligence to make more authentic and satisfying decisions?
So I guess that the head, heart, and gut thing is a little bit of a metaphor, but it's a metaphor for, I think, three different types of intelligence. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think as human beings, we've got two types of intelligence. We've got human analytical intelligence, which comes from the head. Then we've got human intuitive intelligence, which comes from the gut and the heart, so to speak. But these are metaphors. It doesn't literally come from the gut and the heart. So we've got human intelligence, which is human intelligences, plural. Human intelligence is human analytical intelligence and human intuitive intelligence. But then alongside that, we've got artificial intelligence. So I think the world that we're in now, we need to think of intelligence as being hybrid, as a mixture of three different intelligences. So artificial intelligence from a machine, analytical intelligence, human analytical intelligence from the human brain's system 2, and then human intuitive intelligence from our system 1, our intuitive mind. And I think the best results come from using each of those three different types of intelligences for the things that they're good at. So artificial intelligence is good at computing. And a human being can never compute as well as a machine can. So artificial intelligence is good at computing. Human analytical intelligence is good at solving. It's good at solving problems. It's good at logic. And then human intuitive intelligence is good at sensing. So if we think that problems can be approached through computing, through solving, and through sensing, then by using those three different types of intelligence, artificial, human analytical, and human intuitive, that gives us the best of all three worlds. There is a fourth type that I could throw in, and I'll just mention it at the end, of course, and that's emotional intelligence. So maybe there are four types of intelligence if we throw emotional intelligence into the picture: intuitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, analytical intelligence, and artificial intelligence. And those four different intelligences are each good at different things.
In your experience, how do you balance intuition with data-driven decision making in the business world? And how can both complement each other to enhance outcomes?
Okay, yeah, Deepak, it's a great question. How can intuition and data-driven decisions complement each other? A metaphor for this, for me, is a traffic light. So a traffic light has a red light, which means stop, a yellow light, which means get ready, but not sure, and a green light, which means go. So how does that relate to intuition? Well, an analysis. So if you think about intuition and analysis as two different aspects of how the human brain works. So if I'm confronted with a decision and my analytical mind says yes, and my intuitive mind says yes, well, in terms of our traffic light, that's a green light. That's a go. In a word, it's kind of a no-brainer. There's no need to think. Intuition says yes, analysis says yes, green light, go for it. And of course, then the opposite to that is where your intuition says no, and your analytics say no. That's a red light. Again, it's a no-brainer. Don't do it. However, the interesting place to be, of course, is where intuition says yes and analysis says no, or the vice versa of that. So if my intuition says yes, but my analysis says no, then what I need to do in that situation is, I think, check out my intuition. And the book talks about many different ways in which we can actually test our intuition, stress test our intuition, because our analytics are telling us that our intuition might be wrong. If our intuition can stand up to the test of analysis, then we can go with it. Similarly, if the analysis says yes, so let's imagine a spreadsheet and all the figures add up, the analytics are fine, but as an experienced accountant or finance manager, your intuition says, no, there's something not quite right about this. Then in that situation, that's the yellow light again. It's not green or red, it's yellow light, it's stop. And in that situation, it means check out your analytics. Your intuition is telling you that something's not quite right, maybe not quite right with the data. So check out your analytics. So I think that idea of the traffic light of red, which is a no-brainer, don't do it. Intuition says no, analysis says no. Green, that's a no-brainer, go for it. Intuition says yes, analysis says yes. And then the yellow one, the in-between, that's where you have to balance the two to come to a good judgment about what the best thing to do is.
Professor, my last question. What do you hope readers take away from Trust Your Gut? And how do you envision intuition influencing the future of leadership and decision making?
So what do I want? So for anyone who's kind enough to read the book, I hope they get something out of it. What I would like them to get from it is this idea of intuitive intelligence. And what do I mean by that? By intuitive intelligence, I mean that's the ability to notice your intuitions and treat intuition as a form of data. So a gut feeling, you can treat it, it's a piece of data. Your body, your intuitive mind, system one is telling you something. So don't ignore it. So the first part about intuitive intelligence is to notice your intuitions, treat it as data. Then the second part of that is to understand what your intuition might be telling you, to interpret it. So you can understand it. One of the ways to understand what an intuition might be telling you is to know something about the science of intuition. And the book is all about the science behind intuition. What it will help readers to do, I think, is to understand where intuition comes from, when intuition works, when it doesn't work, and so on and so forth. So that's the second piece of intuitive intelligence, is understanding what intuition is and when you should or when you should not use it. And that then takes me to the third part of what intuitive intelligence is, and that's using it to take better decisions. So what I would like people to take away from the book or from this podcast is this idea of intuitive intelligence, which means using your intuition in an intelligent and an informed way. Understanding intuition, knowing when you should trust it, when you should not trust it, and using that information, that knowledge, to take better decisions. And this is all about business, of course, and management. And the things we've spoken about really are about business decision making. But intuitive intelligence applies to your professional life as a manager and as a leader. But I think it also applies to your personal life as well. So, personal decisions, in relationships, in career choices, etc., etc. The same principles apply in professional life and in personal life. So that would be my kind of hope, I think, that people would take on board the idea of intuitive intelligence as the ability to notice, understand, and use your intuitions to take better decisions in your personal and your professional life.
Thank you, Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith, for joining us today on this insightful episode. Professor Sadler-Smith, with your deep expertise in intuition and leadership and your extensive body of work, including your latest book, Trust Your Gut, Go With Your Intuition and Make Better Choices, we have learned how critical intuitive intelligence is to be business success and for personal growth. Your insights today on the power of intuition in decision-making, creativity, and ethical challenges have been incredibly valuable. We appreciate you taking the time to share with your expertise with us. Once again, thank you for being with us, Professor Eugene Sadler-Smith. It's a big true pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Deepak. Again, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be part of your Business Talk podcast series. So thank you very much indeed.